Hello and welcome to today's mini masterclass with me, James Roy. I'm the producer at WestWords, and today I'm talking to a friend of WestWords, Laura Greaves. Now, Laura is a multi-award winning author. She began a career in journalism in the 90s, the late 90s, I hasten to add. She was named both South Australian and Australian Young Journalist of the Year in 2001. She's written 3 novels and 7 non-fiction books. Most of them, or a lot of them, are about dogs, she tells me, because she's a bit of a dog nut. All published in Australia and New Zealand by Penguin Random House. Some of her books have also been published overseas. She also won, and this is interesting, the 2019 and 2020 Dog Writers Association of America's prestigious Rio Award. I think I need to know a bit more about that. Now, Laura lives in the Blue Mountains of New South Wales. She's currently a PhD English candidate at the University of Newcastle, researching what I like to call settler noir, 19th century true crime writing, and a 180-year-old murder, which we have spoken about a little bit in the past on a previous podcast. And she received the National Council of Women Australia Day Award for Women's History and is currently the female orphan school writer in residence at the Whitlam Institute, female orphan school. So she's doing that under the banner of WestWords and the Whitlam Institute at the moment. So after all of that, hey, Laura, how are you?
I'm good, thanks, James.
Tell us a little bit about what you've been doing at the orphan school, just to kick off.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Female Orphan School was the first social welfare institution in New South Wales. And what I'm doing is researching the period from 1800 to 1850. After 1850, it changed a little bit in terms of its remit, I suppose, what types of girls they were taking in, and then it became a psychiatric hospital. The psychiatric hospital later on. So I'm looking at the period 1800 to 1850, and I've been researching the lives of the girls and young women who lived at the school. So looking into who they were, what their backgrounds were, how they found themselves at the school, because despite the name Female Orphan School, almost none of the girls were actual orphans. Most of them had at least one living parent. So I'm looking into what their lives were, both at the school and after their time at the school. And I'm writing about it. But I'm drawing on not just the archival documentation that's available, but the kind of contextualization of the era. So it's an interesting kind of hybrid of fiction and nonfiction, which makes it challenging but fascinating.
When you say that the orphan bit is a bit of a misnomer, was the school thing a bit of a misnomer as well? Was it first and foremost a school?
It was a school, certainly. I mean, not in the ways that we would think of a school now. So the young women that were at the orphan school were given fairly rudimentary education in reading and writing, but the bulk of their quote unquote education was around very sort of feminine pursuits, you might say. Lots of domestic things, cooking, sewing, how to keep house, that kind of stuff. Because the thinking, quite rightly, it turned out, was that most of them would go out into domestic service. And in fact, when they were 13, the girls would all be what was called apprenticed out to families to work for them as kind of live-in maids and governesses and that kind of thing. So it was a school, but it certainly wasn't what we might think of as a particularly well-rounded education in today's context.
And in 1800, considering that the first English settlers arrived here in 1788, 1800, that's not far into the journey of colonial Australia, is it? That's fairly early on.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And when I say that the school kind of changed its incarnations over the years, it was with regards to the backgrounds of the girls coming in. So from 1800 to about 1850, primarily all the girls were the children of convicts.
Right.
And then from 1850 onwards, when Australia was bringing in fewer convicts and more immigrants, they started to be the children of immigrants instead. So they were slightly more diverse in terms of their background and where they'd originated from, and also the social issues that were affecting their families. Because often, when the in the 1800 to 1850 period, they would end up in the school because their mothers were convicts, and they were working off their sentences through servitude, and they were all live-in positions and they couldn't have their children with them. So they didn't have any other option but to send them to the school. And the other thing about the school that makes it more school-like than orphanage-like was that parents or the caregivers of the children, in the few cases where they were actual orphans, had to actually apply to get their daughters in there, and they had to have referees and sort of connections. People had to know about the existence of the school. They had to sort of know people that would take the case of their girls on and sort of lobby for them to be enrolled there. So yes, they were kind of down on their luck and impoverished and destitute in many cases, but they also did have arguably more connections than a lot of you kind of everyday convicts did, if that's even a term that I can use.
Well, it wasn't one of those euphemistic kind of schools that was basically a prison for naughty girls. It was something that people applied for and took very seriously. And it was,
that's
a real opportunity, right?
It had a really good reputation. It certainly wasn't a workhouse, which is what a lot of people think. There was the Female Factory, which was also in Parramatta, which was more of a workhouse kind of setup.
Yeah, that was the comparison I was actually about to make, is the factory, which is about 2 kilometres, 3 kilometres away from where the Orphan School is, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And in fact, they did have, and one of the girls that I'm writing about as part of this residency, sometimes young women from the Female Factory would be employed, again, quote unquote, as kind of monitoresses at the Female Orphan School. So they were, domestic workers, but they had a bit more of a hands-on role with the girls. So that was the sort of the cream of the crop from the Female Factory was sometimes allowed to work at the Orphan School.
Right. Okay. So this isn't the first historical fiction writing you've done, obviously. I read out all those list of achievements and awards and recognition and so forth. But when I contacted you, to ask you if we could do one of these mini masterclasses, you came back immediately with, we could talk about writing historical fiction ethically.
Yes.
And then I think you said, in fact, about writing any fiction ethically, but we started off talking about historical fiction. So ethical historical fiction, I guess that the first question I have for you is, let's go to the opposite of that. What does unethical historical fiction look like?
It's a really good question. And you touched on my PhD there, which I'm doing in English in the general sense, but specifically I'm looking at what you call settler noir, and I do love that genre. And I'm researching an 1842 murder that happened here in the Blue Mountains. And the ethics of doing that have really kind of informed the way that I'm also tackling the writer in residence writing, because the PhD is looking at a young girl called Caroline Collitz, who was murdered in Mount Victoria in 1842. And the whole reason I wanted to do a PhD about her is because nothing has been written about her. It's all been written about the murder, the men that committed the murder, nothing about the victim herself. So what I wanted to do, and what I still want to do, is essentially give her voice back. So to do that unethically, to come back around to your question, would be to just imagine her as a character, to, view her life and the context of her murder through my 21st century feminist lens, to put words in her mouth and thoughts in her head that probably never would have happened. So to completely ignore the context of what life was like for young women in the 19th century here in New South Wales, which can be challenging to not do that because there isn't a lot of archival information available. These girls, both Caroline and the girls at the Orphan School, were often, if not completely illiterate, then as good as. So it wasn't like they were writing letters or keeping diaries that explored their inner lives. So to an extent, it has to be imagined. But to me, to approach it unethically would be to not even attempt to place them in the context of that time and to just write solely from an imaginative point of view and not try to ground it in fact at all, which means there's a lot of research involved to try and answer some of those questions of what would their lives have really been like. So yeah, the unethical thing is to just charge ahead, treat them as though they weren't real people and as though they are just fictional characters as opposed to real women.
So basically treating them like a resource that you can mine rather than a story that you're trying to tell.
That's exactly right. And I think it comes down to why you want to tell the story. Because if you just want to tell an interesting story about a murder, then you would probably take the sort of whodunit approach and spend a lot more time with the male characters and the male perpetrator and delving into their psyches. But that's why I want to tell that story. And that's not why I wanted the residency at the Orphan School, because I want to be able to actually tell the stories of the women. Because I think women's stories are so often overlooked in general, but certainly the stories of women who were poor and uneducated and the daughters of convicts, nobody cared about them at all. They were the lowest of the low. So there was never a lot of effort made to bring their stories to light. So that's the why for me. And I think it's important for any writer to sort of ask yourself that question, well, why is it important to tell these stories? And that will sort of guide you in making good ethical choices, I think.
So do you think this is something that that we find in true crime, for example? I'm not a massive reader of true crime, but my impression seems to be that oftentimes the focus falls onto the process of finding of why the murderer did what they did, how the story went down in tracking them down, the neat little moments of serendipity that led someone to be at this place at the wrong time, and so on and so forth. Do you find that often in true crime people are ignoring the actual, even modern true crime, ignoring the life and the agency of the victims?
Yes, 100%. That's a very easy question for me to answer. Right. And, a lot of the research that I'm doing for my PhD has been around why that's the case and why we seem to consider women's deaths to have so much more value, at least in a literary sense, than their lives. And that's what I'm trying to address and hopefully even redress or reverse a little bit with the work that I'm doing. And it can be applied to the Female Orphan School as well, because although the work that I'm doing around the lives of those young women isn't strictly true crime, it is in a sense because many of them were the daughters of convicts who were brought to Australia because of crimes, most of the time what we would consider to be incredibly petty crimes like stealing a bolt of fabric or something like that. And for that, they're taken away from everything they've ever known and sent to the other side of the planet for God knows how long, with their children in many cases. And then they arrive here and there's no social safety net for them. They can't care for their children, etc. So they are the victims of crime in a sense as well. And there's just no insight or there's no interest in reflecting on, firstly, what made their mothers commit the crimes that they committed that resulted in their transportation. And secondly, no inquiry into what the lives of these girls are like. There was just this very sort of savior complex of, we will take them away from all this temptation and this unpleasantness, and we'll put them in this school out in the country, which is what Parramatta was at the time. And, by keeping them away from the unsalubrious parts of society, they will be good girls. And I just find that really interesting about, why did the people who started the Female Orphan School, although I'm sure they did have good intentions and truly wanted to, give opportunities to young women that otherwise may not have had them, why was the answer to them take them away from society rather than address the issues in society and try and make society better for everybody?
I suppose where my mind went to when you talked about coming out here without a safety net and then going, what do I do? Not so much with what do I do with my kids so much as what do I do for my kids to give them any opportunity. Mm-hmm. My first place I went was, it was colonial Australia. That's how things were. And then I thought, hang on, if somebody asked me to send one of my kids away to never see them again, that would be heartbreaking. And of course it was heartbreaking for these people as well, just as it was heartbreaking for mothers and fathers losing their kids for all of human history.
Yeah.
I think the further back it happens, the easier it is to just sort of gloss over this and go, but it was a different time. Life was cheaper. We only lived till 30. So if you died in,
Yeah, I think that is very much the case. There is this sense of, I don't know, because they lived in times when there was no iPads or internet, that they didn't feel as deeply or think as fully, or their lives weren't as complex and nuanced as our lives are now. And it's such a preposterous position to take, really, because of course, they mourned their children and they were homesick for the only land they'd ever known, and they didn't know if they'd see their families again. And again, to come back to the ethical questions of how you write these stories, to me it seems, page 1 of the ethics handbook, that you have to keep that in mind. You have to understand that in many senses they were exactly like 21st century people, in that they felt the same things that we did. And they, people say, oh, you do the crime, you do the time, etc. But you have to acknowledge that it's an entirely disproportionate response to be taken to the other side of the world for 7 years or forever because you stole some fabric to make a dress to clothe your destitute children.
Someone very close to me recently lost a family member to, not to COVID, but because of the remoteness of where we all are right now, couldn't even be there when their significant other passed away, and had to watch it on FaceTime. And it was easy to kind of go, that's terrible. And of course it is terrible. But then you think, but these people not that long ago, when they got on the ship in London or in England and left, the people they were waving goodbye to at the dock, they knew they would never see those people again. So that was effectively a
death sentence, even though it wasn't.
Correct. Yeah. Certainly for that relationship, there were maybe occasionally letters would get through, but there was no way you were ever going to see that person again.
No, that's right. And in fact, a couple of the girls from the orphan school did ultimately return to England, but they were extremely rare. And sometimes, if they died, it would take 12 months for a letter containing that news to even get back to their loved ones. So it's a year on, and this is the first they're hearing about it,
I was discussing with someone the other day, James Cook, apparently on 2 occasions, came home, saw his wife, spent some time with his wife, as husbands and wives do, and then he would go off on an expedition. And on 2 occasions, he came back to find that while he was away, his wife had given birth to a child who had subsequently died in childbirth. Yeah. And so he'd never met the child that he had. So it was a different time. But I suppose what we're saying here is that the right thing to do is stop and consider just the human toll that takes on a person to lose someone in that way.
That's absolutely right. I mean, one of the young women that I'm writing about for the orphan school, her name was Jane Rogers. And I found the ship surgeon's journals on the ship that she came over on, because she was a convict, actually. She was at the female factory and was then brought into the school to work there as opposed to being a student there. And in the surgeon's diaries, she's referred to frequently because he calls her the worst of the worst. She's absolutely incorrigible, and probably she just wasn't about to let herself be told what to do, and she was rebelling in the only way that she could. But they used to shave the women's heads on board the ships if they misbehaved. That was their punishment, which to me is so rightly or wrongly, women's hair is often such an important part of their identity as a woman, and that's such a cruel thing to do, I think. But also within that same journal, there was lots of children on those ships, and they would die of the conditions and malnutrition and the viruses that would run rampant. And it would just be a line, oh, Mary Smith's twins died last night. Whatever. And now Mary Smith is in the brig because she's misbehaving. Well, of course she is. She's mad with grief, But there was no empathy, no acknowledgement of that. And I think as a writer, a modern day writer trying to tell these stories, the ethical thing, the right thing to do is to have that empathy, to tell those stories with empathy that they were never afforded ever in their lives.
Yeah, I find it interesting that often in historical storytelling, somebody with the most basic of human empathy is often held up as being some kind of hero because they dared to speak out against the norm. I mean, the very fact that the Orphan School was established, I think, by Marston.
Samuel Marston was the man who, it was him and the first governor. I'm not sure. I haven't heard another.
He had a massive reputation. What did they call him? I can't remember the name. It was the lashing parson or the thrashing parson or the... Anyway, he was notorious for being incredibly violent.
Yeah, he was very much of the fire and brimstone, hellfire shall rain down upon thee kind of school of Christianity, which actually makes it, really odd that he would have pushed so hard for a welfare institution.
Maybe he thought he was making up for all his horrible deeds by laying up treasure in heaven by doing one good thing.
Maybe, but it definitely smacks, at least to me, of this is what I think I should do rather than this is something that I'm truly passionate about. Maybe it was his ethics, that prompted him to do that. But at the same time, there's writing from him in the very early days of the school where he talks about why the school needs to exist and how we must take these girls away from temptation. Because it's always about the girls, isn't it? The onus is always on the girls to preserve their dignity or whatever. It's never on the people around them to act responsibly.
Yeah, and of course that nothing much has changed in that regard. We still get addresses from people at the top of the pile in the Australian Defence Force who say that female officers walking back from a night out shouldn't make themselves desirable or attractive.
Yeah, I know. And girls get sent home for showing their shoulders, and it's ridiculous.
Quite bizarre, isn't it?
Yeah.
The other question I had for you then is, in the work that you're doing, it's a fair while ago in Australian colonial history, and a lot of the family of these people would probably have either it's either dwindled away to no real connection. But how do you approach something in a slightly closer time frame where there are family members? I'll give you an example. If I were to want to write a screenplay about someone like, say, Banjo Patterson, considering that Banjo Patterson had family and there are still descendants of Banjo Patterson, what is the ethical approach to telling their story?
It's a good question. And it's one I spend a lot of time thinking about, probably because my earliest incarnation of a career as a writer was as a journalist. So I was always having to approach families that had been through horrible experiences and try to encourage them to have put their faith in me to tell their story well. And now too, even with the books I write about dogs, they're all about people's stories with dogs. So there's a lot of ethical considerations there. And in those cases, I always show them what I've written before it goes to print, because I want them to be happy with it, because my dog books are very feel good and they're supposed to be joyful, and I don't want anything being published that people aren't happy with. But I think that's very easy to do when you have immediate descendants, for example, the dog's owner. If I was writing about a dog that had existed 200 years ago, it might be a different scenario. There are certainly a lot of living descendants of young women that were at the orphan school. So I don't necessarily feel with the writing that I'm doing about the orphan school that I need to be tracking down distant relatives and asking for their permission, especially also because I'm kind of fictionalizing what I'm doing. So I'm taking real people and as much real detail and information as I can find. But then, as I said, I'm kind of contextualizing that with life at that time and kind of coming up with a bit of a hybrid. And also, for practical reasons, just the time scale of the residency, I just wouldn't have time to find all the people. With my PhD, on the other hand, there are a lot of living descendants of not the murder victim, but her husband. He was from a very well-to-do family here in the mountains, and there are a lot of members of that family still living. And I feel like they're not probably going to like what I believe their family's involvement was in the story. But I don't necessarily feel like I need to get permission. I think from an ethical perspective, I'll just try and be as fair and balanced as I can and arm myself with as much fact as I can. But the rest of the time,
that does make it difficult to navigate, though, doesn't it? I mean, in my own family, we knew for a long time that there was a convict in our family.
Mm-hmm.
And there were members of our extended family who were very keen to dismiss that as being a frame up, a setup by a rich family in Manchester at the time who set him up so that the rich guy in town wouldn't go down for this thing. And a couple of people were very determined to make this the commonly accepted version of what happened with Richard Howarth Heaton.
Uh-huh.
Well, my brother went to the Old Bailey and looked up the records and went, no, he did all those things. He was
definitely did it.
But the funny thing was that side of the family was really kind of annoyed by this, and the rest of us really, really excited by it, because if we're going to have a convict in the family, my view is have a proper one.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, gosh, I've got a similar story, but a much more recent one, in that my grandmother's best friend, her son was tried for and convicted of the attempted murder of his wife. Right. And growing up, it was always, oh, he never did this, it was a stitch up, all the rest of it. And then once I got older and actually read the details of the case, he so clearly and badly tried to murder his wife. It's a wonder he ever thought he would get away with it. Right. And the fact that anyone ever believed he was innocent just goes to show, I suppose, their loyalty to his mother. But, oh, yeah, he did it for sure. But there's another side of that coin, especially with regards to the orphan school work that I'm doing, which comes down to own voices. So there is a perception that only white children were at the female orphan school, but that's not correct. There were Indigenous children there as well. And I had that perception when I first started the research. And then I came across several Indigenous young girls who were there. Thought, I really want to include them in the writing that I'm doing. I really want to tell these stories. But I immediately felt uncomfortable about it, because what I'm doing is not 100% fact-based. I'm taking all the facts I can find, but then I'm having to weave those into fiction just because there isn't enough fact to write straight nonfiction. So I've had a lot of conversations with the people at the Whitlam Institute and people at WestWords about what's appropriate. Can I tell these stories at all, being that I'm a white woman who has no Aboriginality in my heritage? Is it appropriate for me to do that? And if not, is it appropriate to just leave these girls out of the story, which doesn't feel right either? They should be included in the history because they are part of the history. So there's a lot, I think, of ethical questions to be asked around that. And the way that we're approaching it is we've spoken to the First Australians Writers Network. So we're actually consulting with some Indigenous writers to get their take on it. They have very kindly undertaken to try and speak to some of the elders in the area that the girls were taken from to be brought to the orphan school, to see if there is any oral history, remaining about those girls and what happened and what were the circumstances that saw them taken. So yeah, I haven't written that one yet because I'm still not 100% sure that I will. I really want to make sure that I do the right thing because, with my PhD, my whole kind of reasoning for it is I just got so angry that so many other people had tried to tell Caroline's story without putting Caroline in it anywhere. So I wanted to restore her to her own story. So how can I be doing a whole PhD with that as the driving force and then turn around and try to tell the stories of young Indigenous girls about whose lives I know nothing? So but that's been a really.
You can't afford to leave them out of the story either, because that isn't fair to anyone, and it's basically.
That's right. That would be whitewashing the history of the place. So I think in the interim, what I'm going to do is sort of refer to the girls in some of the other writing that I'm doing. So I might be writing about one of the white girls, but I might have one of the Indigenous girls as part of that story, but I'm not directly trying to tell her story. But then again, that doesn't sit quite right with me either, because is that just paying lip service to this whole other aspect of history that took place at the orphan school? So sometimes these ethical questions can't be answered right away.
That's right, and the whole own stories question is going to be a question we continue to discuss for a long time, I think, because in the last 5 years or so, it has become very much in the forefront of the conversations we have about this kind of thing.
Yeah.
I've got one last question for you, and James Frey. Now, James Frey, who wrote A Million Little Pieces, and his second book was called My Friend Leonard. I'm sure you recall James Frey.
I do. I haven't read either of the books, but I remember the controversy.
In 2003 and 2005, he wrote these books where they were marketed as being memoirs. And everyone went, these books are incredible. And then it came out they weren't memoirs, they were fiction. And suddenly everybody said they were terrible.
Yeah.
And Oprah in particular tore him down and said, we set you up as being an amazing memoirist, and now you've shown it's all a lie.
Yeah.
Is a good story not just a good story?
That's a really interesting question. Well, first of all, I wonder how much of that, the James Frey situation, and there's also been other ones, like remember Helen Davydenko way back when, representing her story as being fact when in fact it was very much fiction. I wonder how much of it is the author misrepresenting themselves and how much of it is a bit of a marketing decision on the part of the publisher to not exactly lie, but sort of lie by omission, in a sense. And maybe it's a combination of the two things. I don't know. Are publishers being hoodwinked? Are they being sort of calculating, knowing that it will sell better if it's pitched as a memoir? I don't know.
Because you have to think that if they were that good, then if they'd been released as, I haven't read them either, but if they'd been marketed as fiction and they were that good, then they would have had a great response anyway.
You'd think so. But remember, like when when those books came out, and it was a very early noughties thing, that misery memoir. Remember that? Everyone was writing misery memoir. I mean, it's probably a bit like true crime, why we devour true crime the way we do. It's just that the thrill of proximity, I think. This is a terrible story and I can't stop reading it, but thank God it didn't happen to me, there, but for the grace of God kind of thing.
This is why we do ghost tours and
yeah. So I think for sure a good story is a good story and should be able to hold up on its own, but there is just an added thrill, I suppose, a visceral sort of feeling if we think it's real. I don't know why that is. Probably a psychiatrist would be better off answering the why question, but I don't think
I guess it was a very early example of, in a sense, of cancel culture where they, because you've made this one, and I'm not suggesting you did the right thing at all.
Yeah.
In fact, a lot of other things that James Frey has done since that pretty much convinced me that he's not a very nice guy.
No.
But at the same time, it's a bit like the Kevin Spacey thing. I think Kevin Spacey is an amazing actor, but apparently we're not supposed to like Usual Suspects anymore because of some horrible things that Kevin Spacey did. And
it's that whole question of separating the art from the artist. And I don't think it's a blanket answer. I mean, look at Michael Jackson, for example. I'll never listen to another Michael Jackson song because, sure, I can separate the art from the artist within reason, but, not when they allegedly or whatever did really egregious things. So, yeah, I mean, if it was the author knowingly deceiving the audience and there was no sort of encouragement from the publisher or any of that, then I think it's not ethical at all. But it might still be a good read. Who knows?
Indeed.
But I do think, certainly coming from a background in journalism, I think that at the end of the day, we should always try to be as honest as we can. I don't think we should go into something thinking, I'll just deceive people and it'll be fine. Like, remember, that movie with Hayden Christensen where he works for Shattered Glass. Have you seen that one?
No.
Oh, he's this fantastic sort of young whiz kid feature writer for a really prestigious Washington, D.C. political magazine, and it's discovered that he just made up all his stories. So he went into it with the intention of deceiving. Mm-hmm. He wasn't trying to do the right thing and then fudged a few things here and there. He just made it all up and tried to pass it off as real. So that's one end of the spectrum, I think. And then, there's probably less egregious little fibs at the other end. But I do think whatever end of the spectrum we're on, you should at least start by trying to be honest.
That's right. And hope that you don't find yourself in some sort of orphan school because you were a bad girl, right?
Yeah, that's right. Oh my goodness. You should see, after it was the orphan school, it did become what was very non-politically correctly termed a lunatic asylum. And there's a list in the building of the reasons that you could become or be committed to a lunatic asylum. And oh my goodness, the things that would get you labeled a bad woman were just insane. Like
hysteria for a start.
Yeah, and just being a bit sad, or questioning opinions, or like, for example, if you lost 4 of your 8 children, which would drive even the most stable person mad, you could end up in a lunatic asylum because you were grieving. Like, it's just, yeah, the things we did.
Indeed. Laura Greaves, thank you so much for talking with us today about ethical fiction. We could go on and on and on, but we shan't. When do you wrap up when does the writer in residence wrap up?
So I'll have it all completed by the end of this month, being August. And then I'm not sure what the next step will be. I know that when we're allowed to go places again, if that ever happens, the aim is to have some kind of a public event at the school where I can kind of talk about what I've learned and the choices that I've made with the writing. So I'm very much looking forward to that because it's an incredible building. I think once we're out of lockdown and people are allowed to go places, everyone should do the tour of the building because it's absolutely fascinating and beautiful. And then we'll see what happens next.
Cool. Well, thank you very much. We'll talk soon.
Thanks for having me.